The day of my father's funeral should have been about mourning him, but it turned into a circus when my stepsister stood up in front of everyone, claiming Dad promised her his entire business. Everyone was stunned, but I just smiled. I knew something she didn't. A letter from Dad's lawyer would change everything. It was a gray, overcast afternoon, the kind of weather that felt fitting for a funeral. The church was packed, a testament to the kind of man my father had been. He was the kind of person who made an impression wherever he went. People respected him, admired him, and some even feared him in business. As I sat there listening to one of his closest friends share a heartfelt memory, I felt the ache of loss deep in my chest. And then Claire showed up. She was late, of course. That was her style, always making an entrance. She waltzed in wearing a black designer dress that was entirely too tight for the occasion, a pair of towering heels, and sunglasses perched on her head like she was some kind of celebrity. Heads turned as she sauntered down the aisle, and for a brief moment, I thought she might walk straight up to the altar. Claire was my stepsister, the daughter of my dad's second wife. We'd never been close. She was the kind of person who seemed to live for drama, constantly finding ways to center herself in every situation. I should have known she'd find a way to make Dad's funeral about her. As the service went on, people stood to share their stories about Dad, his kindness, his dedication to his work, his love for his family. It was touching and bittersweet. I stayed quiet, content to just listen and remember him in my own way. But then Claire cleared her throat. It was loud enough to cut through the soft murmurs and rustling of tissues. Everyone turned to look at her. She stood up, smoothing her dress like she was about to accept an award. "I have something important to say," she announced, her voice loud and clear. I tensed immediately. This couldn't be good. Claire began to speak, her tone dripping with practiced sincerity. "I know today is a day to mourn, but it's also a day to honor my father's legacy." My jaw clenched. She never called him her father unless it suited her. Before he passed, Dad shared with me something very personal, something I feel I need to share with all of you today. She paused for dramatic effect, glancing around the room like she was some kind of oracle delivering divine wisdom. Then she continued, "Dad told me many times that he wanted me to take over his business. He said I had the vision, the drive, and the heart to carry on what he built. He believed in me." The room was silent except for the sound of a few people whispering to each other. "He didn't just see me as his daughter," Claire went on, her voice trembling slightly as though overcome with emotion. "He saw me as his successor. He said, 'Claire, you're the one I trust to carry on my dream.'" She took a deep breath, her hand resting dramatically on her chest. "This is what Dad wanted. I just hope I can live up to his expectations." I froze. My dad? Trust Claire with his business? The same Claire who had never held a real job in her life, who spent most of her days shopping and posting selfies online. The idea was laughable, but Claire delivered her speech with such conviction that I could see people nodding along, buying every word. My stepmother, who was sitting a few rows ahead of me, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, clearly moved by Claire's words. Some of Dad's business associates exchanged glances, as if trying to reconcile this revelation with the man they had known. Meanwhile, I was sitting there clutching my bag, where the envelope from Dad's lawyer was tucked safely away. I hadn't intended to bring it out at the funeral. I thought it would be inappropriate. But as I watched Claire spin her ridiculous story, I felt a slow, simmering anger build inside me. Claire was lying. I knew it, and deep down, I think she knew it too. Dad had been many things, but he wasn't a fool. He would never have entrusted his life's work to someone like her. The business was his pride and joy, and he'd been very clear about who he wanted to take the reins. As Claire wrapped up her speech with a flourish, I caught her eye. She was basking in the attention, smiling warmly as if expecting applause. Instead, I just smiled back, calm and steady. She had no idea what was coming. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, just 2 weeks before Dad passed. I remember the day clearly. I had just finished helping him with some errands when his lawyer, Mr. Harris, showed up unannounced. It wasn't unusual for him to check in, but the timing felt different. His demeanor was calm, as always, but there was a subtle weight to the way he held himself. "I need to speak with you privately," Mr. Harris said, his voice measured and professional. I followed him into Dad's study, a room that always smelled faintly of leather and cedar. He handed me a sealed envelope with my name scrawled across the front in Dad's familiar handwriting. "This is your father's final letter," Mr. Harris explained. "He wanted you to have it, but with strict instructions. You're not to open it until after the funeral. He believed it would be more impactful then." My stomach twisted at his words. It was the first time the reality of Dad's condition truly hit me. He'd been sick for a while, but seeing that envelope, knowing he'd planned for this moment, made everything feel more final. Did he say what's in it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harris gave me a small, almost knowing smile. He didn't share the details, but he made it clear it's important. Trust your father's judgment. I tucked the envelope into my bag that day and tried not to think about it too much. It felt like carrying a piece of him, something I wasn't ready to let go of just yet. When Dad passed, the envelope became a strange source of comfort. I'd hold it in my hands and wonder what he'd written, imagining it was some kind of goodbye letter. Maybe he wanted to share something personal or leave instructions about the business. Whatever it was, I trusted it would reflect the kind of man he'd always been, thoughtful, methodical, and deeply caring. It wasn't until I actually read it that I realized how wrong I was. The day after the funeral, I finally sat down with the envelope. My hands trembled as I broke the seal, unfolding the neatly written pages inside. The first few lines were exactly what I'd expected. Warm, heartfelt words about how proud he was of me, how much he loved me, and how grateful he was for everything we'd shared. I could almost hear his voice as I read it. But then the tone shifted. By now, you've heard Claire's version of events, he wrote. I can only imagine what kind of scene she's caused. If she hasn't already, she will claim I promised her the business. She may even have the audacity to say it was my dying wish. Let me be clear. That is a lie. My eyes widened as I read on. She's been pushing this narrative for years, Dad continued. She's tried every tactic, flattery, manipulation, even guilt, to convince me that she's the right choice. But the truth is, Claire doesn't understand hard work or responsibility. She's never earned a single thing in her life. And I have no intention of handing over what I've built to someone who sees it as a toy rather than a legacy. I sat back in my chair, stunned. This wasn't just a rejection of Claire. It was a full-blown takedown. Dad went on to detail specific instances where she'd tried to corner him into making promises. There was the time she'd staged a heartfelt speech about wanting to follow in his footsteps during a family dinner, only to disappear for a weekend in Vegas the next day. Or the time she claimed she'd been taking business classes, which turned out to be nothing more than a single online seminar she never finished. He spared no detail, painting a picture of someone who had always been more interested in appearances than substance. I know Claire will try to twist my words after I'm gone, he wrote, but I've taken precautions to ensure my wishes are honored. Mr. Harris has all the necessary documentation, and he knows exactly what to do. If Claire challenges this, she won't win. I trust you to stand your ground and protect what's rightfully yours. I stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity, my emotions swirling. On one hand, I felt validated. Dad had seen through Claire's antics, just as I had, and he'd taken steps to protect his legacy. On the other hand, I felt a deep sadness. This letter wasn't just about business. It was about the fractured relationship between Dad and Claire, a rift that had never healed. At the funeral, as Claire delivered her grand speech about how Dad had entrusted her with his dreams, I couldn't help but think of the letter. She had no idea how wrong she was. The envelope was still in my bag, the weight of it a constant reminder of what was to come. I glanced at her as she spoke, watching the way she played to the crowd, her voice trembling with fake emotion. She was putting on a performance, and she was good at it. But I wasn't worried. Claire was digging herself into a hole with every word she said, and I had the shovel in my hands, ready to hand it over when the time was right. I waited patiently, letting her have her moment. The time to reveal the truth was coming, and when it did, there would be no room for her lies. Claire's speech didn't just last 10 minutes. It felt like 10 years. As she stood at the front of the room, basking in the attention like a spotlight, I couldn't help but marvel at her audacity. She wasn't just bending the truth. She was snapping it in half and building an entirely new reality out of the pieces. Her voice was calm, yet commanding, the kind of tone she probably practiced in the mirror. Dad and I had a very special relationship, she began, glancing around the room as if daring anyone to disagree. He always believed in me, even when others didn't. I bit my tongue so hard I could taste copper. Dad had been polite to Claire out of respect for her mother. But belief? Trust? Those were entirely different matters. Claire barely knew anything about his work, beyond the surface-level Instagram posts she liked to share. She continued, her voice tinged with fake humility. He saw something in me, potential, he called it. He told me I had the kind of vision this business needed. We would talk for hours about it, and he'd always say, Claire, you're the one I trust to carry this forward. I glanced around the room, noticing how her words were landing. Some people were nodding, their expressions soft with sympathy. Others looked confused, like they were trying to reconcile Claire's claims with the man they'd known. A few exchanged subtle glances in my direction, as if wondering why I wasn't saying anything. And then she went for the kill shot. "Dad told me something once," she said, her voice dropping into what I can only assume was meant to sound like a heartfelt whisper. "You're the daughter I wish I'd had," he said to me. Those words meant everything. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Whether she believed it or not, hearing her say that out loud in front of everyone stung in a way I hadn't expected. Dad was my father, my mentor, and the person who'd shaped so much of who I was. To hear Claire twist his memory that was almost unbearable. The worst part was that people were buying it. I could see it in their faces. The pity, the understanding, the soft murmurs of agreement. Claire had always had a way of playing the victim while making herself look like a savior. This time, she painted herself as the grieving daughter, the dutiful heir stepping up to honor her father's wishes. Then she delivered the line that made my blood boil. "This is what Dad wanted," she said, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "He made it clear to me, and I'm honoring his wishes." For a split second, I doubted myself. She sounded so confident, so sure. Could Dad have said something to her that he hadn't shared with me? But then I remembered the letter, the envelope tucked safely in my bag. I knew the truth, and so did Dad. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of whispered conversations. I saw people stealing glances at me, their faces full of questions. Was I keeping something hidden? Did I have anything to say? The weight of their expectations pressed down on me, but I stayed calm, biding my time. Claire looked triumphant, as though she'd just won an argument no one else knew they were part of. She folded her hands in front of her and looked directly at me, her expression daring me to respond. That was when I knew I couldn't stay quiet any longer. I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate. All eyes turned to me, and the whispers stopped. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of the curtains against the windows. Claire's smile faltered just a little, but she quickly recovered, crossing her arms as if to say, "Go ahead, let's see what you've got." "Actually, Claire," I began, my voice steady, "I think Dad had something else in mind." Her face froze, the confidence draining from her expression in an instant. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice sharper now. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope, holding it up for everyone to see. "Dad left me a letter," I said, my eyes locked on hers. "His final letter to us. And in it, he made his wishes very clear." The room collectively inhaled. Claire took a step back, her arms dropping to her sides. "A letter," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "Why didn't I know about this?" "Because Dad gave it to me," I replied, my tone measured but firm. "And he asked me to hold on to it until today." Claire's face flushed red, and she tried to laugh it off. "Well, I'm sure whatever it says just confirms what I've already told everyone." I tilted my head slightly, letting her dig herself deeper. "Maybe," I said, shrugging. "Or maybe it's something entirely different. Would you like me to read it?" The tension in the room was palpable. People were leaning forward in their seats, hanging on every word. Even Claire's usual supporters, the ones who always defended her no matter what, looked uneasy. "I don't think that's necessary," Claire said quickly, trying to regain control. "We don't need to turn this into a spectacle." "It's not a spectacle," I countered. "It's Dad's final words. I think we owe it to him to hear what he had to say." Her eyes darted around the room, searching for someone to back her up, but no one spoke. Finally, she threw up her hands in mock surrender. "Fine. Read it if you think it'll make a difference." I unfolded the letter, taking a deep breath before I began. As I read the first few lines, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. This was Dad's truth, and no amount of Claire's theatrics could change that. "To my children," I began, my voice steady. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. First, I want you to know how much I love you both. My greatest joy has been watching you grow into the people you are today." I paused, glancing up at Claire. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "There's something I need to address," I continued. "Something I know will come up after I'm gone." The room was silent, every eye fixed on me. Claire had no idea what was coming, but I could feel the balance shifting. The truth was finally about to come to light. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Every eye was locked on me as I held the envelope in my hands. My fingers brushed the familiar creases of the paper as I steadied myself. This was it, the moment I'd been anticipating since Claire's ridiculous performance had started. Claire, who had been all smug smiles and faux sincerity just minutes earlier, was now visibly rattled. Her perfectly arched eyebrows furrowed as she pointed at the envelope. "What's that?" she demanded, her voice sharp but shaky. I held the envelope up for everyone to see. "This," I said, my voice calm and deliberate, "is a letter from Dad. His final letter to us." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Claire's eyes narrowed. "A letter," she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Why am I just now hearing about this?" "Because he entrusted it to me," I replied. "He asked me to wait until today to share it. He wanted us to hear his words together, as a family." Claire crossed her arms, her lips twitching into a forced smile. "Oh, I'm sure it's just something sentimental," she said with a nervous laugh. "Probably some sweet little note about how proud he was of me and how much he loved me." I didn't respond. Instead, I carefully opened the envelope, sliding out the letter inside. The weight of the paper felt heavier than it should have, as though it carried all the gravity of the truth. The room was dead silent as I began to read. "To my children," I started, my voice steady but soft. "If you're reading this, it means I'm no longer with you. First and foremost, I want you to know how much I love you both. My greatest joy has been watching you grow into the people you are today. I am so proud of each of you in your own ways." I glanced up briefly. Claire was still standing, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, but her confidence seemed to be unraveling with every passing second. "There is something I need to address," I continued. "Something I know will come up after I'm gone. Claire, I know you've always had big dreams and an even bigger personality. Your passion is admirable, but I've also seen how it can sometimes lead you down the wrong path." Claire's forced smile faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" she muttered, but no one answered her. "I want to be clear about my wishes," I read on. "The business I've built is not just a company. It's my life's work. It's something I poured my heart and soul into, and it's not a decision I made lightly when choosing who would take it over." The tension in the room was palpable. People leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between me and Claire. Some of Dad's colleagues exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of intrigue and unease. "Claire," I said, my voice firm as I read his next words, "I know you've always believed you were destined for great things. But the truth is, you've never shown an interest in understanding what this business truly requires. It's not about glamour or appearances. It's about hard work, dedication, and respect for the people who make it all possible." Claire's face turned bright red. "That's not fair," she burst out. "He always told me I was special, that I had potential." I looked up from the letter, meeting her glare with a steady gaze. "I'm just reading his words, Claire." Her mouth opened as if to argue, but no sound came out. I returned to the letter, my voice unwavering. "I know you've tried to convince me over the years that you were the right person to take over. I've seen your efforts to portray yourself as someone capable and deserving. But actions speak louder than words, Claire, and your actions have shown me that this is not the path for you." A collective gasp echoed through the room. Claire's supporters shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding her gaze. "To be clear," I continued, "I never promised you the business. In fact, I made it very clear to my lawyer who the rightful owner should be. That person is someone who has stood by my side, worked hard to understand the intricacies of what we've built, and earned my trust time and time again." I paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Claire's voice was shrill now. "This is ridiculous. He was my father too. He wouldn't have written that about me." I raised an eyebrow. "You want me to keep reading?" She didn't respond. "The business will go to my daughter," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a knife. "Not because of favoritism, but because she has earned it. She has shown me that she understands the values I hold dear, and I know she will carry on my legacy with the same dedication and integrity that I have always strived for." The room erupted into murmurs, but I wasn't finished. "Claire, I hope you understand that this decision was not made out of malice or favoritism. It was made out of love for you, for the company, and for what I've built. I want you to find your own path, one that makes you happy and fulfilled. But this business is not that path." I folded the letter carefully, sliding it back into the envelope. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire's face was a mix of shock, anger, and something that almost looked like fear. This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling. "You think you can just wave a letter around and everyone will believe you?" At that moment, Mr. Harris stood up, his presence commanding. "I can confirm that this letter aligns with Mr. Lancaster's official will and testament," he said. "The documentation is clear. There is no ambiguity about his wishes." Claire looked like she'd been slapped. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Finally, she spun on her heel and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The truth was out, and Dad's legacy was safe. But the fallout was just beginning. By the time I looked up from the letter, the room felt like it was holding its collective breath. Claire's face was ashen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She looked like she was desperately trying to process what she'd just heard, but the reality was crashing down on her faster than she could handle. Dad wanted the business to go to someone who actually understood it, I said, letting the weight of his words sink in for everyone. Someone who shared his vision, who appreciated what it stood for, and who was willing to put in the work to keep it thriving. I paused, scanning the room as the tension thickened. That person, I said, meeting Claire's wide, furious eyes, was me. The room erupted. Some people clapped, their faces lighting up with approval. These were the people who had worked with Dad, who had seen me alongside him over the years, learning and contributing. Others gasped, their whispers filling the air like static. A few glanced at Claire with a mixture of pity and disbelief. But Claire? She snapped. This is a trick, she shouted, stepping forward so abruptly that the hem of her dress caught on the edge of a chair. She stumbled slightly, but recovered quickly, pointing an accusing finger at me. You forged that letter, didn't you? You always wanted to push me out. Claire, I said, my voice calm but firm, this letter was written by Dad himself. It's signed and dated, and it matches the documents in his will. No, she spat, shaking her head violently. No, this can't be real. Dad told me. He told me I was the one he trusted. Why would he lie to me? Maybe because he knew how you'd react, I said, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. Claire looked around the room, her eyes pleading with anyone who would meet her gaze. You all know me, she said, her voice growing increasingly desperate. You know how much Dad cared about me. He wouldn't just give everything to her. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke up. Claire's outburst had stripped away whatever veneer of credibility she might have had. Just then, Mr. Harris, Dad's lawyer, rose from his seat. He was a tall, distinguished man with a calm presence that demanded attention. I'd like to address the room, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs with ease. Claire froze, her head whipping around to face him. You, she said, pointing at him like he'd betrayed her personally. You're part of this, aren't you? Mr. Harris didn't flinch. Claire, he said evenly, your father was very clear in his wishes. This letter is entirely authentic, and it aligns perfectly with the official documents he prepared before his passing. No, it doesn't, she insisted, her voice rising to a near scream. You're lying. You've always been on her side. I'm not on anyone's side, Mr. Harris replied calmly. My role is to ensure your father's wishes are carried out. Nothing more. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. If anyone here has doubts, I have additional documents to corroborate everything stated in that letter. The sight of the folder seemed to suck the fight out of Claire. Her shoulders slumped slightly, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. But then, in true Claire fashion, she rallied. This isn't over, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. You think you can just wave a bunch of papers around and steal what's mine? I'll fight this. I'll take you to court if I have to. Mr. Harris sighed, his expression one of almost paternal patience. You're welcome to contest the will, Claire, he said, but I can assure you, your father left no room for interpretation. His wishes are clear, and his documentation is airtight. Claire's face twisted in fury. You can't just, this isn't fair, she shouted, her voice cracking. I felt a pang of something. Was it pity? Anger? Both? It was hard to tell. Claire had always been good at turning situations into spectacles, but this was on another level. This isn't about fair, Claire, I said, my tone softer now, but no less resolute. It's about what Dad wanted. He made his choice, and we owe it to him to respect that. Claire laughed bitterly, a sharp, hollow sound. Oh, please, don't act like you're doing this for him. You're just as selfish as you've always been. Enough, Mr. Harris interjected, his voice firm. Claire, your father's decision was not a personal attack on you. It was a decision based on what he believed was best for the business and the legacy he built. I suggest you take some time to process this before you say anything else you'll regret. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Claire looked like she wanted to scream, cry, and storm out all at once, but she seemed frozen in place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she grabbed her purse and turned toward the door. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice low but venomous. You'll regret this. Both of you. And with that, she stormed out, her heels clicking angrily against the floor. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving the room in stunned silence. As the tension began to dissipate, people started to murmur again. Some came up to me, offering words of support or quiet congratulations. Others just shook their heads, muttering about how embarrassing Claire's behavior had been. But all I could think about was Dad. I felt a wave of emotion, relief, sadness, and a deep sense of responsibility. This was what he had wanted, and now it was up to me to honor that. Mr. Harris approached me, his expression kind but serious. "Your father believed in you," he said quietly. "And so do I. You'll do great." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle on my shoulders. This was just the beginning, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But for now, I was grateful. Grateful for Dad's faith in me, and for the truth that had finally come to light. Dad's legacy was safe, and I was ready to carry it forward. The moment Claire's hand gripped the edge of the table to steady herself, I knew things were about to get messy. Her face was flushed, her breathing erratic, and her eyes darted frantically around the room like a cornered animal. The air seemed to grow thicker with every passing second as the weight of reality finally crashed down on her. "This is a joke," she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained fury. "You all can't seriously believe this, right? This isn't real. It can't be." Her voice cracked on the last word, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then, as if on cue, she turned her frustration outward, launching into a tirade that left no one safe from her wrath. "You," she snapped, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You've always been the favorite, haven't you? Always Daddy's little princess, always getting whatever you wanted. He never cared about me. And now you're stealing everything from me." I stayed seated, keeping my expression neutral. There was no point in feeding into her theatrics. Around us, the room was silent except for Claire's escalating shouts. "You think you're so perfect, don't you?" she continued, her voice rising. "Do you even know what it's like to be treated like an outsider in your own family? Do you?" "Claire," I said quietly, my tone measured, "this isn't about me being the favorite. It's about Dad's wishes." Her eyes narrowed, and she let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "His wishes? Are you serious? He lied to me, just like he always did. All those times he told me I was important to him, that he trusted me. I guess that was all just for show, huh?" Claire turned to the crowd, her arms outstretched in a dramatic gesture. "You all know how much Dad loved me," she cried, her voice breaking. "You've seen how close we were. You know this isn't right." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved, no one spoke, and no one came to her defense. Even her staunchest supporters, her mother included, sat frozen, their faces a mix of pity and discomfort. Her mother, my stepmother, looked especially mortified. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with Claire, as though she wished she could disappear. For years, she defended Claire's behavior, brushing off her tantrums as harmless outbursts. But now, with everyone watching, even she couldn't find a way to excuse this level of self-absorption. The lack of response seemed to push Claire further over the edge. She clenched her fists, her voice becoming more frantic. "What is wrong with all of you?" she shouted. "You know me. You know what Dad and I meant to each other. How can you just sit there and let this happen?" Still, no one spoke. By now, Claire was pacing, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. Her frustration boiled over into incoherent muttering as she ranted about how unfair everything was. At one point, she grabbed a glass of water from a nearby table, taking a shaky sip before slamming it back down. "I should have known this would happen," she said bitterly, glaring at me. "You've always been so smug, always acting like you were better than me. Well, guess what? You're not." I took a deep breath, keeping my tone calm. "Claire, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm just honoring what Dad wanted. He made his decision, and it's final." Her eyes flashed with anger, and she took a step closer. "You don't get to play the victim here," she spat. "You've always had everything handed to you on a silver platter. You didn't earn this. You don't deserve it." "Enough," Mr. Harris interjected, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "Claire, this conversation is over. Your father's wishes were clear, and his documentation is legally binding. Further outbursts will not change that." Claire turned on him, her face contorted with rage. "Don't you dare tell me what's over," she hissed. "You're just as bad as the rest of them. You've been helping her steal what's mine." "Claire," he replied evenly, "I suggest you take some time to calm down before making any more accusations. This is not a matter of opinion. It's a matter of fact. Your father's will is airtight, and any attempt to contest it would be a waste of time and resources. She stared at him, her chest heaving with fury. Then, without warning, she grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice echoing through the room. "You'll regret this. Every single one of you." With that, she slammed the door behind her, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. The tension in the room seemed to dissipate the moment she was gone. People shifted in their seats, murmuring quietly to each other. A few glanced at me, their expressions a mix of relief and sympathy. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that," one of Dad's longtime business partners said, patting my shoulder. "She's completely out of line. Don't let her get to you," another added. "Your dad made the right choice. Anyone who knows you can see that." Even my stepmother, who had been silent throughout the entire ordeal, approached me hesitantly. I didn't know she'd react like that," she said, her voice shaky. "I'm sorry." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The truth was, I wasn't surprised by Claire's meltdown. She'd always been dramatic, but this had taken things to a whole new level. As the room began to settle, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was finally out. Sadness for how far Claire had gone to twist Dad's memory. And a deep sense of responsibility for what lay ahead. Mr. Harris approached me, his expression kind but serious. "She may try to contest this," he said quietly. "But don't worry. Your father made sure everything was airtight. She doesn't have a leg to stand on." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just about legalities or business. It was about honoring Dad's legacy. And no matter how messy things got, I was determined to do just that. For now, though, I was just grateful the worst of it was over. The storm had passed, and the room seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. All that remained was the truth, shining clearly in the aftermath of Claire's chaos. The funeral reception felt like a blur. People milled about in the church's small banquet hall, balancing plates of catered finger foods while exchanging solemn condolences. A steady stream of attendees approached me, their faces etched with sympathy and, in some cases, lingering shock from Claire's meltdown. "You handled that so gracefully," said one of Dad's former colleagues, a man I vaguely remembered from holiday parties at the office. "I don't know how you stayed so calm." "It's what Dad would have wanted," I replied, offering a polite smile. Inside, though, I felt far from calm. My mind replayed the day's events in an endless loop. Claire's dramatic outburst, the letter, the stunned faces in the crowd. Another guest, one of Dad's closest friends, clapped me on the shoulder. "Your father was a straight shooter," he said, his tone almost conspiratorial. "He'd have hated all that nonsense from Claire. You did right by him today." I nodded, murmuring my thanks. The truth was I wasn't sure how to feel. On the one hand, I was relieved that the truth had finally come out, that Dad's wishes had been honored despite Claire's best efforts to rewrite history. On the other hand, the entire ordeal left me emotionally drained. Dad was gone, and the weight of his legacy now rested squarely on my shoulders. As the crowd began to thin out, I found myself standing by the coffee station, staring into a lukewarm cup of decaf. My stepmother, Lisa, approached hesitantly, her expression unusually subdued. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice barely audible over the hum of distant conversations. "For how Claire behaved. I didn't know I didn't think she'd take it that far." I glanced at her, unsure of how to respond. Lisa had always been fiercely protective of Claire, often excusing her behavior or brushing off her worst tendencies. But now, she seemed genuinely shaken. "It's not your fault," I said finally. "Claire made her own choices." Lisa nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. I know she's hurting," she said, wringing her hands. "She loved your father in her own way, but I also know she's made mistakes. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive her someday." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I didn't respond right away. Forgiveness felt like a distant concept, something I might consider once the dust had settled. For now, I could only focus on moving forward. True to her word, Claire didn't let things go quietly. Barely a week after the funeral, I received a notice from her lawyer, stating her intent to contest the will. "She's wasting her time," Mr. Harris said during our meeting to discuss the matter. He spread a stack of documents across his desk, each one meticulously prepared and signed by Dad. "Your father's wishes are clear, and his estate plan leaves no room for interpretation. Claire doesn't have a legal leg to stand on." Despite his assurances, the process was grueling. Claire's lawyer filed motions and requests for mediation, dragging the matter through the legal system for months. Each time I thought we'd reached the end, another letter or court date would arrive, keeping the conflict alive. Claire's strategy seemed less about winning and more about wearing me down. She flooded the proceedings with baseless claims, accusing me of manipulating Dad in his final days and forging documents. The accusations were ludicrous, but the constant back and forth took its toll. Outside the legal battle, the family dynamic became even more strained. Some relatives sided with Claire, buying into her narrative that she'd been cheated out of her rightful inheritance. They whispered about favoritism, questioning whether Dad had been fair in his decisions. Others stood firmly in my corner, recognizing Claire's antics for what they were. My aunt, Dad's younger sister, was particularly vocal in her support. "Your father worked too hard for her to come in and ruin everything," she said during one of our phone calls. "Don't let her get away with this nonsense." The division created a rift that felt impossible to bridge. Family gatherings became tense and awkward, with people tiptoeing around the subject or avoiding each other altogether. What used to be warm, lively celebrations now felt like walking through a minefield. In the end, Claire's efforts were for nothing. After months of legal wrangling, the court ruled in my favor, upholding Dad's will in its entirety. The judge's decision was firm and unequivocal, leaving Claire no room for appeal. When the ruling was announced, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. It was finally over. The business, Dad's legacy, was safe, but the victory was bittersweet. I thought of Claire, wondering if she truly believed her own lies or if her fight had been driven purely by desperation. I wondered if there had been a moment, even a small one, where she considered letting go and accepting the truth. After the ruling, Claire disappeared from family events entirely. She stopped returning phone calls, even from Lisa, and retreated into her own world. Occasionally, I'd hear snippets of gossip, how she was living in a smaller apartment now, how she'd started a new job she hated. Part of me wanted to reach out, to try and repair what was left of our fractured relationship. But every time I thought about it, the memory of her meltdown and the months of legal battles resurfaced, making it impossible to take the first step. Instead, I focused on the business. Running it was a challenge, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. Every decision I made felt like a tribute to Dad, a way to honor everything he'd built. In quieter moments, I'd think about the last words of his letter. "I trust you to carry this forward," he'd written. Those words became my mantra, guiding me through the difficult days. Claire might have tried to rewrite the story, but in the end, Dad's truth prevailed. And for that, I was deeply, endlessly grateful. Taking over the business was like stepping into a new world, one that was both thrilling and overwhelming. The first few weeks were the hardest. I had to familiarize myself with decades of operations, financial reports, and employee dynamics, all while trying to navigate my own emotions. Losing Dad had left a hole in my life, but stepping into his role gave me a way to stay connected to him. Dad's office became my new sanctuary. I didn't change much about it. The darkwood desk, the collection of books on leadership, and the framed photos of milestones in the company's history all stayed where he'd left them. Sitting in his chair, I'd often find myself running my fingers along the smooth edge of the desk, imagining him doing the same during long nights of strategizing. It was comforting, even if bittersweet. The team Dad had built over the years turned out to be my greatest asset. Many of them had worked with him for decades and knew the ins and outs of the business better than I did. They were patient, supportive, and willing to teach me everything I needed to know. "You've got this," said Carla, the head of operations, during one of our late-night strategy meetings. "Your dad trusted you for a reason, and so do we." Her words stuck with me. Every day, I worked to live up to that trust. While I was busy rebuilding and learning, Claire seemed to vanish from my life entirely. At first, it was a relief. After months of legal battles and her public meltdown at the funeral, I couldn't imagine how we'd even begin to have a normal conversation. But as time passed, her absence felt strange. She stopped showing up at family events, even ones she'd never missed before, like our stepmother Lisa's birthday dinner. Lisa tried to make excuses for her. She's been really busy, or she needs time to process everything. But it was clear Claire wasn't just avoiding me. She was avoiding everyone. The few times I did see her were by chance, like the time I bumped into her at a coffee shop. She froze the moment she saw me, her face turning pale as she muttered a quick hello. She didn't stick around to chat, and I didn't press her. At first, I thought I'd feel triumphant. After all, she tried to undermine Dad's wishes and drag me through the mud in the process. But what I felt instead was an unexpected pang of sadness. Dad had always given Claire more chances than she deserved. He wanted so badly for her to rise to the occasion, to find a sense of purpose and responsibility. I remembered him encouraging her to join the business in a small capacity years ago, hoping it would spark some kind of interest or discipline in her. Everyone has potential, he told me once after she flaked on an important meeting. Some people just need a little more time to realize it. But Claire had squandered every opportunity. She'd skip meetings, ignore deadlines, and brush off constructive feedback. When Dad eventually stopped inviting her to participate, she acted like she'd been betrayed, not realizing that she'd burned the bridges herself. Now, as I look back on those moments, I realized just how much Dad had tried to include her in his vision, only for her to reject it time and again. Running the business wasn't just about keeping the lights on. It was about protecting what Dad had built from people like Claire. I knew she'd always seen the company as a prize, something to flaunt rather than nurture. But to me, it was so much more. It was a reflection of his values: hard work, integrity, and a deep respect for the people around him. Every decision I made, no matter how small, felt like an extension of his legacy. There were tough days, of course, days when I felt like I was in over my head, or when I worried I'd never measure up to the standard Dad had set. But there were also moments of clarity and pride, like the time I introduced a new initiative to modernize the company's operations, or when I successfully negotiated a major partnership that Dad had been working on before he passed. In those moments, I felt him with me, as if he were guiding me from the sidelines. Despite everything, I couldn't stop wondering about Claire. Part of me wanted to reach out, to try and find a way to bridge the gap between us. But every time I considered it, the memory of her betrayal held me back. I thought about the day of the funeral, the way she'd stood in front of everyone and twisted Dad's memory to suit her own narrative. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was selfish, a blatant disregard for everything he stood for. I knew I couldn't let her back into my life, at least not right now. The wounds were too fresh, and the trust between us was gone. But I also knew I couldn't let bitterness consume me. Dad wouldn't have wanted that. Instead, I chose to focus on the business and the people who believed in me. Slowly but surely, I found my footing, building on the foundation Dad had laid while bringing my own perspective to the table. Every day brought new challenges, but it also brought new opportunities to honor his memory. I wasn't just running a company. I was continuing a legacy, one that had been built on honesty, perseverance, and love. Claire, meanwhile, became something of a ghost. The family stopped hearing from her altogether, and even Lisa admitted she didn't know where she was living or what she was doing. "I just hope she's okay," Lisa said one evening, her voice heavy with worry. "She's made mistakes, but she's still my daughter." I didn't have the heart to tell her what I really thought, that Claire needed to face the consequences of her actions before she could ever hope to move forward. For now, all I could do was focus on what lay ahead. I couldn't change the past, and I couldn't control Claire's choices. But I could honor Dad's trust in me by doing the best I could with the gift he'd left behind. Moving forward wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And with each passing day, I felt closer to him, like he was still there, cheering me on from wherever he was. The fallout from Claire's meltdown and the legal battle that followed was a tidal wave that fractured the family in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, it felt like a ripple, a few strained conversations, awkward silences at gatherings. But soon, the cracks began to deepen. Lines were drawn, and people started picking sides. Some relatives were quick to back Claire, buying into her narrative of being the wrong daughter. She spun a tale of betrayal that was as melodramatic as it was false, portraying herself as the victim of Dad's alleged favoritism. She claimed I had manipulated him during his final days, painting me as a cold, calculating opportunist who had taken advantage of his declining health. It stung more than I cared to admit. She always did have a flair for storytelling. I muttered one evening to Carla, Dad's trusted operations manager. Carla chuckled dryly. "It's not storytelling, it's rewriting history. Anyone who knew your father would see through her lies. But that doesn't stop people from listening when it suits their own narratives." That was the problem. Claire's story gave some relatives exactly what they wanted: an excuse to justify their own grievances or resentments. Uncle Mike, who'd clashed with Dad over a failed investment years ago, was particularly vocal in his support of Claire. "I'm just saying," he remarked at one family dinner, "maybe your dad wasn't as fair as you think he was. Claire has a right to feel hurt." "Mike," Aunt Linda snapped, her tone dripping with disdain, "you're only saying that because you've been bitter ever since George didn't bail you out of your bad decisions." The tension in the room was palpable. I sat quietly, trying not to fan the flames, but it was hard not to feel the weight of every pointed comment and loaded glance. There were, thankfully, those who stood firmly in my corner. Aunt Linda was one of them. She had always been close to Dad, and she knew the truth about his relationship with Claire. "Your father was a good man," she told me one afternoon over coffee. "He loved Claire, but he wasn't blind to her faults. He made his decisions for the right reasons, and you need to hold your head high." Her words gave me strength, but the constant tug-of-war within the family was exhausting. Every event turned into a minefield, with certain relatives refusing to attend if they knew I'd be there, while others made a point of avoiding Claire. It wasn't just the big gatherings either. Smaller moments, like holiday dinners or casual get-togethers, became sources of stress. Invitations were carefully worded, and seating arrangements were planned like battle strategies. Even Lisa, who usually tried to keep the peace, seemed at a loss for how to mend a rift. "I just want things to go back to normal," she admitted during one of our strained conversations. "Lisa," I said gently, "I don't think there's a normal to go back to. Not anymore." The divide wasn't just a family issue. It rippled into the business as well. A few employees who had been close to Claire whispered their doubts about me, questioning whether I was the right person to lead. "She doesn't have the experience," I overheard one of them saying in the break room. Claire may not have been perfect, but at least she had the guts to fight for what she wanted. It was hard not to take those comments personally. But every time I felt the weight of doubt creeping in, I thought about Dad and the faith he'd placed in me. He hadn't made his decision lightly, and I owed it to him, and to myself, to rise above the noise. Mr. Harris, Dad's lawyer, offered a surprising source of comfort. During one of our meetings, he shared a story about another family he'd worked with who had gone through a similar ordeal. "The truth is, wealth and legacies have a way of bringing out the worst in people," he said, his tone matter of fact. "I've seen siblings who were inseparable turn into enemies over far less than what's at stake here. It rarely ends well." His words gave me perspective. As painful as it was to see the family torn apart, I wasn't alone in this experience. It was a grim reminder of how money and power could warp even the closest relationships. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all felt unbearable. Late at night, I'd sit in Dad's office, surrounded by his books and papers, and wonder if I was doing the right thing. Had I been too rigid in defending his wishes? Should I have found a way to compromise with Claire, even after everything she'd done? But then I'd think about the letter, the clarity with which Dad had expressed his intentions, and the doubts would fade. He had trusted me to carry out his vision, and I couldn't let his memory down. As the months went on, the dust began to settle, though the rift remained. Claire's camp grew quieter, their outrage losing steam as it became clear that the business wasn't going anywhere. Lisa occasionally tried to mediate, suggesting that Claire and I meet to clear the air. But every time the idea came up, I felt a wave of resistance. I wasn't ready to face her, not yet. "I just don't understand why she can't let this go," Lisa said during one particularly emotional phone call. "It's tearing the family apart." "Because it's not just about the business," I replied, my voice weary. "It's about everything she's ever felt about Dad, about me, about herself. This isn't something I can fix, Lisa. She has to want to fix it herself." In the end, I realized that the family might never fully heal. Some relationships would recover over time, while others would remain strained. The scars left by Claire's actions were deep, and it wasn't something that could be smoothed over with a few apologies or forced reconciliations. But I also knew that I couldn't let the division consume me. My focus had to remain on what mattered most, honoring Dad's legacy and building something he would be proud of. As painful as it was to see the family divided, I found solace in the knowledge that I had done what was right. Sometimes, doing the right thing came at a cost, but it was a cost I was willing to bear. Still, in quiet moments, I couldn't help but wonder if things would ever go back to the way they used to be. Or if, like so much else in the wake of Dad's passing, some things had changed forever. The morning was crisp and quiet as I drove to the cemetery, the sky a soft gray that seemed to hold the promise of rain. A year had passed since Dad's funeral, and the weight of his absence had shifted in that time. Not lessened, exactly, but transformed into something quieter and more reflective. As I parked the car and stepped out, the cool air filled my lungs, grounding me in the moment. I carried a bouquet of his favorite flowers, sunflowers and lilies, wrapped in simple brown paper. Dad had always appreciated things that were straightforward yet meaningful, and it felt right to honor him in that way. Walking through the rows of headstones, I felt a strange mix of emotions. It was hard to believe a full year had gone by. So much had happened, yet it felt like only yesterday that we'd gathered here to say goodbye. When I reached his grave, I paused, letting the moment settle around me. The headstone was simple, engraved with his name, dates, and the words, "A man of integrity and vision." Those words had been my suggestion, and as I read them now, I felt a deep sense of pride. I knelt down, placing the flowers gently at the base of the stone. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the stillness wrap around me. "Hi, Dad," I said quietly. The words felt strange at first, but soon they started to flow naturally. "I thought it was time I came to see you," I continued. "It's been a year, and a lot's happened. The business is doing well. Really well, actually. I've made some changes, but nothing too drastic. I think you'd approve." I smiled, thinking of the many late nights I'd spent in his office, poring over reports and plans. "Your team's been amazing. They've supported me every step of the way. Carla especially, she's like a rock. She told me the other day that I reminded her of you. I don't think she knows how much that meant to me." As I spoke, I felt the familiar ache of missing him, but it was accompanied by something softer, gratitude. Despite everything that had happened, the drama, the legal battles, the strained family dynamics, I knew I'd done what he wanted. "Claire's been well, Claire," I said, shaking my head slightly. "She never apologized, and I don't think she ever will. But you know what? That's okay. I made my peace with it. She has her own path to figure out, and I can't control that." I thought back to the months of turmoil that followed his death. Claire's meltdown at the funeral, the legal fights, and the way the family had splintered into factions. It had all felt so overwhelming at the time. But now, with some distance, I could see it for what it was, a painful but necessary part of the process. "I think you knew this would happen," I said softly. "You knew she'd try to twist things, and you made sure there was no way she could. You always were one step ahead, weren't you?" I stayed there for a while, telling him about everything, new projects at the business, milestones I'd reached, and even little stories about the employees who had been with him for years. It felt like he was still with me, listening in his quiet, thoughtful way. Before I left, I leaned forward, tracing the edge of the headstone with my fingers. "I miss you," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "Every day. But I feel you with me, guiding me, and that means everything. Thank you for trusting me, for believing in me. I won't let you down." As I stood up and dusted off my knees, a sense of lightness washed over me. The heaviness I'd carried for so long, the grief, the stress, the weight of responsibility, felt like it had finally lifted, leaving room for something new. Walking back to the car, I thought about how far I'd come in the past year. The business was thriving, and while the family might never fully heal, I had found my own sense of peace. Dad's wisdom had saved not just the company, but also my sense of purpose. In his final letter, he'd written, "I trust you to carry this forward." Those words had been my anchor through the storm, and now they felt like a compass, guiding me toward the future. As I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, I took one last look at the cemetery through the rearview mirror. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly at ease. The chapter had closed, and while I still missed him every day, I knew he would have been proud. And for that, I would always be grateful.